The candles at Ashworth House had never burned so bright as they did the night the Duke made his choice, and never, in all the long years that came after, would he forgive himself for the words he spoke beneath them. But that night lay some months ahead still. To understand how a man of sense and standing came to ruin the best thing in his life before 500 watching eyes, one must begin earlier, in a quiet room where a single candle burned much lower, and where the only sound was the labored breathing of a dying woman. The old Duchess of Ashworth had been failing by inches all that spring. She had been a great beauty once, and a greater wit, and the illness had taken the first, and sharpened the second, so that even near the end she could still raise a laugh from the two people who kept the long watches with her. One was her heir, Julian, the Duke of Ashworth, a tall man with dark hair silvered at the temples and a cold, handsome face. The other was her companion, Miss Eleanor Shaw, a slight woman with chestnut hair and steady grey eyes, who for 3 years had read to the Duchess through the dark hours, warmed her tea when her hands shook too badly to hold the cup, and turned her toward the window when the pain would not let her rest. The Duchess loved no living creature half so well as she loved these two, and it did not escape her, even through the fog of her medicines, that over those 3 years they had come, quietly, to love one another. Eleanor Shaw had come to the house with nothing but a small trunk and a set of excellent references. She was the orphaned niece of a country parson, reared in a cold vicarage, where usefulness was prized far above beauty, and complaint was reckoned a sin. And she had learned early that a woman without fortune must make herself indispensable, or make herself scarce. She had chosen the former. In 3 years she had never once been heard to raise her voice, never been caught idle, never asked for a half-day that she had not first earned twice over. The great house ran the smoother for her being in it, and the servants who missed nothing had long since decided she was quality of a kind that had nothing at all to do with blood. Only the Duchess had guessed how much quiet feeling lay banked beneath all that composure, and how much of it had come, by slow degrees, to settle upon her heir. It was not a thing that had ever been spoken of in a drawing-room. It had grown instead in the sick-room, in the small hours, in the space between duty and exhaustion, the way the truest things so often grow where no one is watching. Julian would come up from the estate books near dawn and find Eleanor still at his mother's side, and he would sit with her in the hush, and sometimes they said nothing at all for an hour together, and the nothing was better company than any conversation he had ever had in a ballroom. Once, when the candle had burned down to a stub, and the Duchess slept at last, he had taken Eleanor's hand across the coverlet and told her low that when the morning was over he meant to make her his wife. Eleanor had not wept, nor exclaimed, nor pretended to a surprise she did not feel. She had only turned her steady grey eyes upon him and said that she would hold him to nothing he might one day regret. That a man in grief was not always a man in his right mind, that he should wait and be sure. He had almost laughed. There was nothing in the whole world, he told her, of which he was more certain. Near the very end, the Duchess had summoned the last of her strength to press her own sapphire into Eleanor's palm, a deep blue stone the color of a winter dusk, the one jewel she had never let out of her sight, and she had folded the thin fingers closed over it. "Guard him when I cannot," she had whispered. "He will need you far more than he knows." Eleanor had promised. And then the Duchess was gone, and the great house was hung in black, and for a little while grief made honest people of them all. But grief is a poor steward of estates. When the black crape came down from the windows, the Duke's man of business came up from the study with his ledgers under his arm, and the news he carried was not good. The late Duke had left debts that the Duchess's long illness had only deepened. The roofs at the hall wanted mending, the tenant farms wanted seed and repair, and the interest owed to certain gentlemen in town grew fatter with every quarter that passed. Ashworth was old and proud and, beneath its gilt, alarmingly hollow. Into this arithmetic swept Julian's aunt, Lady Marchbanks, a sharp-eyed dowager in perpetual grey bombazine, who had an opinion on every subject under heaven and mercy for none of them. She had watched her nephew grieve for a decent interval, and now she considered the interval concluded. "You will marry money," she informed him over breakfast, as though remarking on the weather, "or you will sit and watch this family sink beneath the water it has been treading for 20 years. There is no third path. Sentiment did not build this house, and sentiment will not save it." She had a candidate ready to hand, of course. Lady Marchbanks was never without a candidate, Miss Georgiana Pembroke, a polished beauty in ice-blue silk with a diamond at her throat, was the sole heir of a Bristol shipping man who had died leaving a fortune whispered from Bath to Mayfair to be beyond ordinary counting. Half the unmarried peerage had already laid siege to her drawing-room. "But a duke," said Lady Marchbanks, with the satisfaction of a general placing her strongest piece, "a duke outranks the whole shabby field of them. She will have you for the coronet, and her gold will float this leaking hulk of a house for 100 years. Now what, precisely, is your objection?" Julian's objection had chestnut hair and steady grey eyes, and was at that very hour in the morning-room sorting his late mother's letters into bundles tied with faded ribbon. But he did not say so. He said only, into his cooling coffee, that he would think on it. And there was, in truth, a great deal to think on. Ashworth was not merely a house, but a whole small country of dependents, the families in the tenant cottages, the old servants pensioned in the village, the almswomen in the row his grandmother had endowed, all of them looking to the Duke as men look to the weather, having nothing else to look to. If the estate went down, it would not go down alone, it would drag 100 humbler roofs under with it. Julian told himself, in the long reaches of the night, that a man in his position did not have the luxury of marrying to please his own heart, that a duty owed to so many must surely outweigh the wishes of any one man, or of any one woman. It was a noble-sounding argument. It had only the single flaw that he did not, in his deepest heart, quite believe it, and knew that he did not. He thought on it through a sleepless week, and the thinking corroded him. He told himself that Eleanor, of all people, would understand, that she who had nursed his mother knew better than anyone what the estate meant, what the tenants meant, what the ancient name carved over the door required of the man who carried it. He told himself that an understanding whispered over a deathbed was not a betrothal announced in the papers, that no banns had been read, no settlement drawn, no promise printed for the world to hold him to, that he was, in the eyes of the law and of society, entirely free. Each argument was a small, cold coin, and he counted them over and over in the dark until he had gathered just enough to purchase his own conscience. The change in him came on by degrees, and Eleanor, who had learned to read him better than any book, saw it long before he found the courage to say a word. He stopped seeking her out at odd hours. He no longer sat with her in the hush. When the servants were within earshot, he addressed her as one addresses a paid dependent, with a courtesy so smooth and so distant that it cut like a cold draught under a door. Once, gathering her nerve, she asked him quietly whether anything was the matter. He looked at her as though from the top of a very high tower, and said that a great many things were his concern now which could be no concern of hers. She did not ask again. She was not a woman who asked twice. Once, and only once, in that miserable season of half-measures, he came very near to telling her the truth outright. He found her in the library at dusk, returning a book to its shelf, and something in the plain sight of her, a slight woman with chestnut hair and steady grey eyes, going quietly about a small task in the failing light, struck him so hard that he nearly crossed the room and confessed the whole of it. The debts, the aunt, the heiress, the cowardice, all of it laid bare at her feet where it belonged. He got as far as her name. She turned and waited with that grave patience of hers that asked for nothing and forgave a great deal, and his courage failed him at the gate. He said instead that he hoped she was comfortable in her rooms, and that she must apply to the housekeeper for anything she lacked, and he watched something in her face quietly close, like a shutter drawn against the coming night, and he hated himself, and he did nothing. The final break came at the Harringtons' ball, beneath 1,000 candles in a room dressed for a triumph. Eleanor was there in a plain grey gown, on the arm of no one, invited only because the late Duchess's oldest friends still remembered her devotion and would not see her forgotten. She had not wished to come. She had come because to stay away would have looked like hiding, and she was done with hiding. Julian arrived late, with Miss Georgiana Pembroke on his arm, and the whole glittering room turned to look. He had never appeared to greater advantage, a tall man with dark hair, silvered at the temples, and a cold, handsome face, and the heiress beside him gleamed like frost in the candlelight. It was in that very moment of every eye upon him that one of the gossiping matrons near the pillars asked him, in a carrying voice, who the plain grey person by the column might be, for she seemed to be waiting on someone who had not come. He might have said, a friend of my late mother's. He might have said her name with honor. He might, most easily of all, have said nothing at all and let the moment pass. Instead, stung by the eyes upon him and hungry to plant his flag firmly beside his glittering prize, he said the thing that would haunt him to the end of his days. That? He did not trouble to lower his voice. That is only my mother's companion. A worthy enough woman, I am sure, in her small way. But one cannot expect such persons to know the moment when a room has quite moved beyond them. The matrons tittered behind their fans. Georgiana Pembroke smiled her cool diamond smile. And Eleanor Shaw, a slight woman with chestnut hair and steady grey eyes, stood very still beside the column, and heard every syllable of it, while the warm candlelight went on glittering off the gilt and the glass as though nothing whatever had broken in the world. She did not faint. She did not flee. She did not give the room the satisfaction of a single tear. She inclined her head to him across all that shining distance, a small exact bow, the courtesy one offers a stranger of rank, and then she gathered her plain grey skirts in both hands and walked out through the tall doors with her chin level and her step unhurried, and the doors were closed behind her by a footman who could not quite meet her eyes. He did not go after her. He told himself there was nothing to go after, that a scene in a public ballroom was precisely the thing a man of his rank must never make. He handed Miss Pembroke in to supper instead, and smiled, and said clever things he did not afterward remember, and the whole while a small, cold weight was settling somewhere beneath his ribs that would not be reasoned away. Later, in the swaying dark of the carriage home, Georgiana studied him with her clear and unillusioned gaze. "You were unkind to that woman tonight," she observed, not with reproach, but with the mild interest of a naturalist noting the habits of a beast. Men who are unkind for an audience are generally cowards underneath. I shall have to keep that in mind, Your Grace. And she looked out of the window and said no more, and Julian found he had no answer that would not prove her point. She left Ashworth House within the week. She would take nothing beyond the wages owed her, and the sapphire the Duchess had pressed into her hand at the last. Even that, Lady Marchbanks tried to reclaim, arriving at the door of Eleanor's narrow room with her palm turned up and the words "family jewels" already on her lips. But Eleanor had kept the Duchess's own note, written in the Duchess's own failing hand, gifting the stone freely and forever to the woman who had earned it. She unfolded it once, in silence, and let the Dowager read it. And then she closed the lid of her trunk with a soft and final click. That was the end of the discussion. On the morning she left, the old housekeeper, who had served 3 generations of the family and feared no one living, came down to the side door to see her off, and stood twisting her apron in her hands, and could not speak for weeping. Eleanor took the worn old hands in both of hers and thanked her, steadily, for every kindness across the years, and bade her mind her knees on the cold back stairs, and did not weep herself until the hired carriage had turned the corner and the great grey house was well out of sight behind her. Then, and only then, and only for a little while, she let herself grieve, not for the coronet she had never once coveted, but for the man she had believed him to be in the sick-room, who she now understood had perhaps never entirely existed. And when the little while was over, she dried her face, and looked ahead down the road and began, quietly, to consider what a woman alone might yet make of a life. Where she went, no one at Ashworth troubled to ask. Julian told himself he was relieved to have the awkwardness of it removed from his house. If some small, stubborn voice within him went on repeating a dying woman's words in the quiet before sleep, "He will need you far more than he knows," he drowned it each night in the business of his courtship. There was a wedding to arrange now, a fortune to secure, a great sinking house to haul back above the water. He had chosen his course, and a man who has truly chosen, he told himself, does not stand about staring at the door that has shut. The courtship of Miss Pembroke was a cold and brilliant campaign, conducted like a treaty between 2 powers who did not much like one another but saw the use of an alliance. Georgiana was clever, and she was watchful, and she had the rare honesty of the very rich. She did not pretend to a warmth she did not feel. She let it be known, without the least embarrassment, that she would look closely at the settlements before she looked kindly at the man. Her attorneys came down from London and shut themselves up with the Duke's man of business for long grey afternoons, and when at last they emerged, their faces wore the particular blankness of men who have been adding a column of figures that stubbornly refuses to come right. At a long, cold dinner given in the heiress's honor, Julian watched Georgiana preside over her end of the table with a competence that would have done credit to a viceroy, and felt, where affection ought to have lived, only a faint and constant chill. She required nothing of him but his title and his good behavior, and gave nothing in return but the same. Twice in the course of the interminable evening, he caught himself turning to share some dry, unspoken observation with a companion who was not there, who was at that hour 3 streets and a whole world away, and each time the empty place beside him seemed to grow a degree colder. He drank rather more than he was accustomed to, and went home early, and slept badly, and told himself it was the wine. Society, meanwhile, had done what society always does. The tale of the Duke and his mother's discarded companion had gone round every drawing-room from St. James's to the far end of the Row inside of a single week, and though a good many people laughed at it, not all of them laughed the way Julian had assumed they would. The older women who had loved the late Duchess remembered perfectly well, who had sat beside her through the dying, who had warmed the tea and turned the pillow and read aloud the long nights through, and they did not at all care for the manner of a man who could stand in a lit ballroom and name such a woman only anything. In trading Eleanor away, the Duke had made himself a shade colder in the eyes of the very people whose good opinion he had imagined he was buying. The old Countess of Wexham, who had been the late Duchess's dearest friend in all the world, made her own verdict plain in the way such women do, without a word of open reproach, and with a coldness there could be no mistaking. When the Duke bowed to her at the opera, she gave him the precise, glacial half-inch of a nod that a great lady reserves for a tradesman who has overcharged her, and turned back to her box, and did not speak to him again the whole evening. It was noticed. Everything in that world was noticed. And the story that went round the next morning was no longer quite the amusing tale of a duke who had risen above a paid dependent. It had begun, ever so subtly, to curdle into the tale of a duke whose given word was worth precisely nothing, which is the one story from which no amount of rank can wholly protect a man. And then, within the space of a single fortnight, the whole glittering edifice he had built came down about his ears, stone by stone. The first blow was the fortune itself. The Duke's man of business laid it before him, with the careful, level voice of a physician disclosing a mortal diagnosis. The famous Pembroke gold was, very largely, a rumor that had been dressed up as a fact, and paraded so long that everyone had forgotten to inspect its papers. The Bristol shipping man had died with the bulk of his capital tied fast inside a trading concern that 3 creditors and a suit in Chancery had already carved up among themselves like a goose at a feast. What remained free and unencumbered was a respectable competence for a country squire, and a bitter joke for a duke, nowhere near enough to lift the weight of Ashworth's debts, and freighted besides with the dead merchant's own lingering obligations, which any husband would find himself wedded to the very moment he was wedded to the bride. The second blow, following hard upon the first, was the heiress herself. Julian, badly shaken, went to Georgiana, meaning to speak plainly of settlements, and of what might yet be salvaged, and discovered that she had already been shown the same accounting, and had drawn from it a conclusion far colder than his own. "You cast off a woman who nursed your own mother to her grave," she said, drawing on her gloves with unhurried care, not troubling to look up at him, "because you had persuaded yourself that I was the richer prospect. Well, I find, your grace, that I have no particular wish to marry a man for whom I was never a person at all, but only ever a sum written at the bottom of a page. And now that the sum has proved a false one, there is nothing left between us to discuss, is there? We should not suit. I begin to think that we never should have, and a polished beauty in ice blue silk with a diamond at her throat rose and swept from the room and left the Duke of Ashworth standing quite alone in the middle of it, having lost in a single stroke the fortune and every last scrap of face along with it. Lady Marchbanks, a sharp-eyed dowager in perpetual grey bombazine, took the collapse of her grand design precisely as such women always do, by discovering, overnight, that it had been no design of hers at all. "I never trusted that Pembroke money," she announced to her nephew, over the ruins of the scheme she had spent an entire season pressing upon him. "Trade fortunes are all show and no substance. Anyone might have told you as much." Julian looked at his aunt for a long moment, and thought of a great many things he might have said, and said none of them, because he had at last begun to understand that the fault had never truly been hers. He had listened to her, yes, but it was he who had done the thing. It was always, he saw now, he who had done the thing. And where, through all of this, was Eleanor Shaw? She was rising. Quietly, without noise or announcement, in the way she had always done everything that was worth the doing. It emerged by slow degrees, as such things do, that the modest companion had possessed all along a great aunt away in the north, a formidable, solitary old woman who had quarrelled bitterly with half her blood and outlived the other half, and who had spent her last decade watching, through a patient correspondence of years, the single relation who ever wrote to her without once, in all that time, asking her for money. When the old woman died that summer in her cold stone house among the moors, she left the whole of it, without condition or caveat, to Eleanor, a snug and prosperous estate, a comfortable, independent fortune settled entirely upon herself, and a handsome house in town not 3 streets distant from Ashworth's own front door. And the wonder of it, the thing that undid Julian more thoroughly than any reversal of his own ever could, was that Eleanor did not change in the smallest particular. She did not crow. She did not cut the people who had laughed at her. She did not spend wildly, or grow grand, or repay a single slight. She opened up her townhouse, and she was gracious in it, and she remembered everyone's name and everyone's small kindness and everyone's private grief, exactly as she had once remembered the Duchess's every comfort in the sick-room. And society, which loves nothing on this earth quite so dearly as a person who plainly does not need it, came to her in a flood. Within a single season, the most coveted card in London was an invitation to one of Miss Shaw's evenings, where the talk ran clever and the music ran fine, and the hostess had a gift, rare as rubies, for making the shyest and least regarded guest in the room feel, for 1 golden hour, like the most interesting soul in all of England. She had become, without lifting a single finger to seek it, the most admired woman of the season, and she wore, at the very height of her triumph, one deep sapphire gown, the single saturated jewel tone in a whole ballroom of pale and careful silks, cut the exact winter dusk blue of the stone a dying duchess had once folded into her hand. The final, exquisite turn of the wheel came when Lady Marchbanks herself, who had once stood in a narrow room with her palm out, demanding the return of a dead woman's gift, found that a card to Miss Shaw's Thursday evenings had become the one thing in all of London she could not command. She angled for it. She dropped hints, and then broader hints, and at the last, swallowing a lifetime of precedence, she called in person to leave her card and was received with a courtesy so flawless and so complete that she could find nothing whatever in it to take offense at, and nothing whatever in it to take comfort from either. Eleanor was gracious to her. Eleanor was gracious to everyone. That was the whole of her revenge, and it was perfect. Precisely because it was not revenge at all, it was simply the woman she had always been, now standing at last where the light could reach her. Julian saw her first from across just such a room. He had come, half against his own will, to a great rout he could not decently decline. And he had not known that she would be there, had not understood, until he was through the doors, and it was far too late to retreat, that the house itself was hers. And there she stood beneath 1,000 candles, a slight woman with chestnut hair and steady grey eyes, robed in that deep sapphire, at her ease as a duchess in her own domain, with a ring of admirers 3 deep about her. She was laughing, warm and unguarded, at something a white-whiskered old admiral had said, and she was without any question the warmest and most living thing in all that cold, bright, glittering room. The regret did not steal upon him gently by soft degrees. It came all at once, like a plunge through river ice, and having come, it did not leave him again. He saw, with a clarity so sudden that it turned him ill where he stood, the whole shape of the thing he had done. He had held safe in his own 2 hands the one person in the world who had loved him for no reason of gain or rank or advantage, who had guarded his mother to her final breath, who had asked him for exactly nothing, and he had named her nothing, aloud, in a crowded room, and bartered her away for a fortune that was smoke and a bride who had seen straight through him. He had called her only his mother's companion. He understood now far too late that she had been the whole living heart of his mother, and might have been the whole of his own. He went home from that bright house, and did not sleep. Somewhere past 2 he rose, and lit a candle, and took down the bundle of his mother's letters that he had never yet had the heart to read fully through, and found among the last of them one she had written to a friend and never sent, in which she spoke of her companion. He read it standing at the cold hearth. His mother had written that Eleanor Shaw was the finest creature she had ever known, worth 10 of the painted misses the season paraded across its ballrooms, and that her one remaining prayer was to see her heir wise enough to know it before the world talked him out of his own good sense. He read it twice. Then he sat down in the dark with the letter in his hand, and understood, fully and for the first time, the exact size of the thing he had thrown into the fire with 3 careless words. He wrote to her the next morning. She did not answer. He wrote again, and then a 3rd time, and the 3rd letter he entrusted to no servant, but carried himself, on foot, through a cold and driving spring rain, to her door, the door of the handsome house not 3 streets from his own, and there he stood upon the step like any common supplicant, and asked, humbly, whether he might be received. She received him. That, too, was Eleanor. She would not deny even a drenched and foolish man the plain dignity of a hearing. She had him shown into a warm parlour, and gave him tea he found he could not drink, and then she sat with her hands folded quiet in her lap, and her steady grey eyes resting on his face, and she simply waited for him to speak. And the Duke of Ashworth, a tall man with dark hair silvered at the temples, and a cold, handsome face, though there was nothing cold in it now, set down the cup that rattled in his hand, and rose to his feet, and then, before he had rightly decided to do any such thing, he went down. He knelt on the hearthrug of her parlour like a man come to prayer, and he told her the truth, the whole of it, with not one soft word left to hide behind, that he had been a coward and a fool, that he had wanted the gold to save a house of stone, and had let it rot clean through the one good thing left in him, that he had said a cruel and unforgivable thing in a crowded room to purchase the regard of people whose whole regard together was not worth the least of her fingers, that his mother had known him, at the last, far better than he had ever troubled to know himself. He will need you far more than he knows, and that she had been right in every particular, and that he was, at last and entirely, undone. I have no fortune left to offer you, he said, low, to the fire, and to her folded hands. You have a great deal more of it than I do now, and I find that I am glad of that, which is a thing the man I was a year ago could never have brought himself to say. I have nothing on this earth to lay before you but the plain and naked fact that I love you, that I have loved you, I think, since the sick room and the guttering candle, and that I have never in all my life been so ashamed of anything I have done as of 3 words spoken in a ballroom, only my mother's companion. I do not dare to ask you to forgive them. I ask only this, whether there exists any road at all, however long, however hard, however far I must crawl along it upon my knees, by which a man might begin to earn back the thing he was fool enough to throw away. Eleanor let the silence stand a long while. The fire snapped and settled in the grate. The sapphire at her wrist, for she had had the Duchess's stone set into a slender bracelet, and wore it always now, caught the light and held it. You knelt in just that same posture at your mother's bedside, she said at last, and every promise that you made to her there, you kept faithfully to the very end. And then you broke the one promise you made to me the instant a brighter coin was lifted up to catch the light. I am not a stone, Julian, to be pressed into a palm and taken up or set down as it suits the hour. I will not be gathered up again merely because the other thing you reached for turned out in the end to be paste. He bowed his head lower. He had no answer to make, because there was none to be made. So here is what I will tell you. She went on, and her voice was not unkind, which was somehow harder to bear than plain anger would have been. I do not hate you. I am not even angry any longer. Anger costs a person more than you are presently worth to me, and I have found far better uses for my strength. But neither will I marry a man on the strength of one wet evening, and one very fine speech delivered from his knees, where speeches are always easiest of all to make. If you meant a single word of what you have said, then you will show me, not in letters, and not upon this hearthrug, but out in the plain daylight, over a long and patient while, in the full view of every last person who stood in that ballroom and heard you name me nothing. You will court me openly, as an equal, and you will bear whatever the world chooses to say of it, and you will not once complain of the bearing. And at the end of all of that, if by then you have truly become the man your mother believed that you might one day be, I will give you my answer. It may very well not be the answer you are hoping for. That, Your Grace, is the whole of what your choosing has left you. A chance, and no promise at all. I find that it is exactly as much as you once left to me. She rose. He rose with her. She did not offer him her hand, and he did not so much as think of presuming to reach for it. She walked him herself to the door of the warm and gracious house that was entirely, unassailably her own, and she drew it open with her own hand, and the cold night air came flooding in around the two of them. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, and there was something almost gentle in it, which was the most terrible thing of all. "You know your own way from here. It is only 3 streets." And the Duke of Ashworth went back out into the driving rain, a smaller and a humbler man than he had come, with everything in the world left to prove, and nothing whatever promised to him, while behind him, in the steady golden candlelight of the house that was hers, the woman he had once called Nothing turned back to her waiting guests in her deep sapphire gown, the single bright and living color in all that pale and glittering room, holding at long last, in her 2 steady gray hands, every card that there was in the world to hold.